I was working at a hostel in Sydney when an American family walked in, dragging massive suitcases behind them. The dad looked around nervously and asked me where the grocery store was. I pointed down the street. He nodded, then leaned in closer and whispered, "Is it safe to walk there? Like, are there drop bears on the way?" I blinked. He was dead serious. His wife pulled out a printed article about drop bears she'd found online. I had to gently explain that drop bears were a joke Australians tell tourists. They didn't believe me. "You've already seen it. I don't just collect travel stories. I track cultural blind spots in real time. Most channels tell you what happened. I tell you what it reveals. If that kind of insight clicks for you, this is where you subscribe." The dad said, "Better safe than sorry," and called an Uber for a 2-minute walk. Another American couple checked in that same week. They asked if they needed to book a tour guide to visit Bondi Beach. I said, "No, you just take the bus and walk onto the sand." The woman looked confused. "But how do we know where to stand? Don't we need assigned spots?" I realized she thought beaches worked like theme parks with tickets and zones. Her husband asked if there were lifeguards who would watch their bags while they swam. I explained that you just keep an eye on your own stuff or ask someone nearby. He looked genuinely stressed and said, "That sounds risky." Back home, everything's supervised. They ended up hiring a private beach assistant for the day. Then there was the guy who came downstairs at 3 in the morning, panicking because he heard weird screaming outside. I went to check. It was just possums fighting in the trees. He said, "I thought someone was being murdered. Why doesn't anyone do anything about those things?" I told him possums were protected and pretty normal here. He shook his head and muttered, "This country's wild," then went back to bed with earplugs. But my favorite was the young woman who asked me, in all seriousness, if Australians had electricity in rural areas. She'd seen a video about the outback and assumed it was like the 1800s out there. I told her yes, we have power, internet, even cell service in most towns. She seemed disappointed. "Oh, I thought it was more primitive." She'd packed a solar charger and a hand crank radio just in case. When I told her Sydney was a modern city with trains, skyscrapers, and coffee shops on every corner, she laughed nervously and said, "I thought it'd be more rugged." She genuinely believed she was visiting a wilderness survival zone. These weren't rare moments. I saw this kind of confusion almost every week. Americans arriving in Australia, expecting danger, isolation, or chaos, then realizing it's just a normal developed country with different animals and slang. This is the pattern most people miss. It's not about confusion, it's about calibration. I break these shifts down every week so you can actually see how cultures collide beneath the surface. Subscribers don't just watch. They understand, but the adjustment period? That's where the stories get good. I was bartending in Melbourne when a group of American tourists came in, sweating and looking shaken. One of them asked for ice water, then downed it in seconds. He slammed the glass on the bar and said, "How do you people survive without air conditioning everywhere?" I looked around. The bar had AC, he clarified. "No, I mean outside." We walked 10 minutes from the hotel and almost died. It was 28 degrees Celsius. Warm, sure, but not extreme. His friend chimed in, "We don't have shade like this back home. It's brutal here." I explained that Melbourne weather changes fast, and you just dress in layers. He looked at me like I'd suggested climbing Everest. Layers in summer. They spent the rest of the afternoon inside, convinced they'd narrowly escaped heat stroke. My coworker told me about an American guest who called the hotel front desk at midnight, asking if it was safe to sleep with the window open. The staff member said, "Yes, it's fine, we're in a safe neighborhood." The guest pressed further, "But what about spiders?" She explained that spiders don't usually climb to the 3rd floor, and even if one got in, most weren't dangerous. The guest wasn't satisfied. He asked if the hotel provided mosquito nets or window screens with reinforced seals. She told him the windows had standard screens. He sighed and said he'd keep it shut. The next morning, he complained about the room being stuffy. When she suggested opening the window, he shook his head firmly. Not worth the risk. Another guy checked into a rental apartment in Brisbane and immediately called the property manager, asking where the emergency supplies were. The manager was confused. What supplies? The guest listed them off. First aid kit, flashlight, battery radio, bottled water stockpile. The manager explained that Australia doesn't have hurricanes or tornadoes like the US, so emergency kits aren't standard. The guest argued that bushfires were a thing. The manager agreed but said Brisbane's suburbs weren't exactly bushfire zones, and the building had smoke alarms and sprinklers. The guest still wasn't happy. He went out and bought his own survival kit, complete with a whistle, thermal blanket, and freeze-dried meals. His roommate said he kept it by the door for the entire month, just in case. I had a customer at the bar ask me if tap water in Australia was drinkable. I said yes, it's perfectly safe. He squinted. Like for Americans too? Or just locals who are used to it? I explained that water quality doesn't work like that. He nodded slowly but still ordered bottled water. Later, I overheard him telling his friend, "I'm not risking it. Their immune systems are probably different." A woman came into the hostel one afternoon looking exhausted. She'd tried to walk from Circular Quay to Darling Harbour and got lost. I pulled up a map and showed her it was less than 2 kilometers. She groaned. "That's like a mile and a half. I didn't know I'd have to walk that much." I suggested taking a ferry next time. It's quick and scenic. She frowned. "Are the ferries safe? Like, do they have life jackets?" I assured her they did, and that ferry travel in Sydney was extremely routine. She still looked doubtful. "I'll think about it." She took an Uber instead. Then there was the college kid who asked me if Australians used real money or if everything was digital. I said we use both, just like most places. He seemed relieved. "Good, because I didn't bring cash. I assumed you guys were either super advanced or super behind." He handed me his card for a drink, then asked if the machine would charge him extra for being American. I explained that his bank might have foreign transaction fees, but the bar wasn't adding anything. He nodded, but checked his banking app 3 times that night to make sure he wasn't overcharged. Every purchase, every drink. His friends made fun of him, but he said, "You can never be too careful abroad." One evening, a middle-aged couple asked me how to get to the Blue Mountains. I told them there's a train from Central Station. Takes about 2 hours. The husband asked if the train was safe. I said yes, it's a normal commuter train. He pressed on. "But is it crowded? Are there assigned seats?" I explained it's first-come seating, like most trains. His wife looked nervous. "What if it's full and we have to stand for 2 hours?" I suggested going during off-peak times. She still seemed unsure. They ended up booking a private driver for 4 times the cost because they wanted guaranteed seats and a controlled environment. When they got back, they admitted the mountains were beautiful, but said the whole trip felt risky without a guide. My friend who worked at a tour company had an American client who asked if the Great Barrier Reef tour included a safety diver who'd stay with her the entire time. She explained that snorkeling was supervised, but not one-on-one unless you paid for a private guide. The client seemed shocked. "So I'm just supposed to swim around by myself with fish and coral?" My friend assured her it was safe and that guides were nearby. The client reluctantly agreed, but spent the whole tour clinging to a pool noodle, convinced something would go wrong. Afterward, she left a review saying the experience was too independent and not structured enough. Another American asked me if Australia had emergency services like 911. I told him yes. "It's Oro Zero here." He repeated it back slowly. "Zero, zero, zero." I nodded. He pulled out his phone and saved it in his contacts, then asked, "Does it work for Americans or just citizens?" I stared at him. "It works for everyone. It's emergency services." He seemed embarrassed, but muttered, "Just making sure." I was working at a train station in Perth when an American tourist approached me, holding a printed train schedule and looking panicked. She asked which platform her train was on. I pointed to the board above us, showing real-time departures. She glanced up, then back at her paper. But this says Platform 3, and the board says Platform 2. I explained the board updates if platforms change. She didn't trust it. What if the board's wrong? I'll miss my train. I assured her the board was accurate and updated automatically. She stood there for 5 minutes, staring at both, paralyzed by indecision. Eventually, she followed the crowd to Platform 2 and made her train. She still looked stressed. Another guy asked me where he could validate his ticket. I told him tickets in Perth don't need validation. You just tap on and off with your card. He held up a paper ticket he'd bought online. But I printed this. Don't I need to stamp it somewhere? I explained that printed tickets already have a barcode and don't need stamping. He looked lost. So I just... Get on? I nodded. He walked toward the train, stopped, came back and asked, "Are you sure? What if they fine me?" I promised him it was fine. He boarded, but kept checking with other passengers the entire ride. A family asked me how to buy groceries at Woolworths. I said you just pick items and pay at checkout, like any store. The mom nodded, but then asked, "Do we need a membership card? Or do you have to be Australian?" I told her no, anyone can shop there. She seemed relieved, but still looked unsure. 10 minutes later, I saw them standing outside the store, reading the entrance signs like they were instructions. They eventually went in but came out with only bottled water and snacks. Later, I heard them talking about how complicated grocery shopping was without clear directions. My coworker had an American guest call the front desk, asking how to use the shower. The staff member was confused. The guest explained that the knobs didn't have hot and cold labels, just red and blue dots. The staff member said red is hot, blue is cold, like everywhere. The guest said, "How was I supposed to know that?" and hung up annoyed. The next day, he left a note saying the hotel should provide instruction sheets for international visitors. I met a woman who'd been in Sydney for 3 days and still hadn't figured out the Opal card system for public transport. She said she kept tapping on but forgetting to tap off, so her account was getting charged random amounts. I explained you have to tap both times or it charges the maximum fare. She groaned. Why don't they just charge a flat rate? This is so confusing. I told her it's distance-based, like most transit systems. She shook her head. In New York, you just swipe and go. This feels like homework. Then there was the guy who asked me if restaurants in Australia brought the check automatically, or if you had to ask. I said you usually have to ask. He looked shocked. So I just sit there waiting until I figure it out? I explained that's how it works in most countries outside the US. He said, "That's so inefficient. What if I'm in a hurry?" I suggested flagging down the server when he's ready. He tried it that night and came back complaining that it took 5 whole minutes. Back home, they bring it right when you finish eating. A couple asked me if they needed to tip housekeeping at their hotel. I said tipping isn't required in Australia, but you can if you want. The husband looked confused. So they just clean for free? I explained they're paid a proper wage. He didn't get it. But don't they expect tips? I said no, wages are built into the cost. He left $2 on the dresser anyway, just in case. One American woman asked me how to know which side of the sidewalk to walk on. I said there's no official rule. People just flow naturally. She seemed stressed. But what if I'm going the wrong way and block someone? I told her to just be aware of her surroundings. She spent the rest of her walk looking around nervously, second-guessing every step. My friend who drove for Uber had an American passenger ask him if it was legal to talk to the driver or if there were rules about silence. My friend laughed and said, "Talk as much as you want." The passenger seemed relieved. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to break a cultural rule. They chatted the whole ride, but the passenger admitted he'd spent the first 5 minutes silent because he didn't know the etiquette. I worked a shift at a cafe where an American asked if we had normal coffee. I asked what he meant. He said, regular drip coffee, not fancy stuff. I explained that most Australian cafes do espresso-based drinks like flat whites and lattes. He looked frustrated. Can't you just make plain coffee? I offered him a long black, which is close. He tried it and said it was too strong. He ended up ordering tea. Another tourist asked me if pharmacies in Australia required prescriptions for basic medicine. I said yes, for prescription meds, but over-the-counter stuff is available. He held up a bottle of ibuprofen he'd brought from home. Good thing I packed my own. I didn't know if I'd be able to buy this here. I told him ibuprofen is sold everywhere. He shrugged. Better safe than sorry. A woman came into the hostel asking if there were instructions for using the washing machines. I pointed to the simple dial with settings. She stared at it. There's no screen? I said no, it's a basic machine. Just choose a setting and press start. She looked overwhelmed. What if I picked the wrong one? I suggested using the normal cycle. She did, but checked on it 3 times during the wash, convinced she'd broken something. I was working at a beachside cafe in the Gold Coast when an American family sat down and asked for menus. I handed them over. The dad scanned it quickly and said, "Do you have ranch dressing?" I said no. He looked disappointed. What about free refills on soda? I explained we don't do free refills in Australia. He seemed shocked. Seriously? Not even one? I shook my head. His kids groaned. The mom asked if we had kids' meals with toys. I said we have kids' meals but no toys. The dad muttered, "This is going to be expensive." They ordered reluctantly, then were surprised when the food came out and actually tasted good. The mom admitted, "Okay, this is better than I expected." But they still complained about paying for each drink separately. Another American asked me why Australians don't smile at strangers as much. He said he'd been trying to make eye contact and smile at people on the street, but they just looked away. I explained that Australians are friendly, but not overly outwardly expressive with strangers. He seemed hurt. I thought you guys were supposed to be laid back and nice. I told him we are, just in a different way. He said, "It feels cold compared to the South where I'm from." By the end of his trip, he'd adjusted, but he still thought Australians were reserved. A woman came up to me at the hostel, looking embarrassed. She asked if Australians thought Americans were loud. I carefully said that it's a common observation, yeah. She sighed. I've been trying to be quieter, but my friends don't care. We got shushed at a pub last night. I explained that Australians value not disturbing others, especially in public spaces. She appreciated the honesty, but said, "It's hard. We're just used to being louder back home." One guy asked me why everything in Australia closed so early. He'd tried to find food at 9 at night, and most places were shut. I said, "That's normal here. We're not a 24-hour culture like some US cities." He looked frustrated. How do people survive? What if you get hungry late? I suggested planning ahead or finding a late-night kebab shop. He said, "That's so inconvenient," but eventually got used to it. I had a customer ask me why Australians abbreviate everything. She'd heard people say Arvo for afternoon, Servo for service station, and Brekkie for breakfast. Why not just say the full word? I laughed and said it's just how we talk. She said it made her feel left out because she didn't understand half the slang. I gave her a quick lesson, and she started using some of the terms herself. By the end of her trip, she was saying, "No worries," and "cheers," like a local. Then there was the guy who couldn't understand why Australians were so casual about everything. He said, "I asked someone for directions and they were like, 'Yeah, mate, just head down there, you'll be right.' No details, no street names." I explained that's just our communication style. We assume you'll figure it out. He said, "In the US, we give step-by-step directions with landmarks. This feels too loose." He got lost twice, but eventually embraced the chaos. A woman asked me why Australians say, "How are you going?" instead of "How are you doing?" I said it's just a regional phrase. She laughed. It sounds so weird. I keep wanting to correct people. I told her language varies everywhere. She admitted it was growing on her and even started using it herself. My coworker told me about an American who complained that Australians didn't do small talk the same way. He said, "I tried chatting with someone at the bus stop, and they just nodded and looked away. Back home, people would have a full conversation." I explained that Australians are polite, but don't always engage in lengthy small talk with strangers. He said, "It feels lonely." But later, he made friends at a hostel and realized Australians are warm once you get to know them. One tourist asked me why Australian TV shows and movies had subtitles on streaming platforms. I said it's because of accents and slang. He seemed offended. "I'm American. I speak English. Why would I need subtitles?" I suggested trying without them first. He did, and came back the next day admitting he missed half the dialogue. He turned them on and said, "Okay, I get it now." A family asked me why Australians don't celebrate Thanksgiving. I explained it's an American holiday. The mom said, "But don't you guys have something similar?" I mentioned we have Australia Day, but it's different. She seemed confused. "So you just skip November?" I said we have normal Novembers, just without Thanksgiving. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. Another guy asked me why healthcare worked differently here. He'd heard Australia had universal healthcare and didn't understand how. I gave a basic explanation of Medicare. He said, "So you don't have to pay for doctor visits?" I clarified there are some costs, but much less than the US. He looked skeptical. That sounds too good to be true. He ended up needing a clinic visit and was shocked at the low cost. He said, "This would have been hundreds back home." A woman told me she felt weird about the coffee culture in Australia. She said, "Everyone's so serious about their flat whites and cappuccinos. I just want a regular coffee." I explained coffee's a big deal here. She tried a flat white and admitted it was the best coffee she'd ever had. By the end of her trip, she was a convert. One tourist asked me why Australian coins were so confusing. He couldn't tell the denominations apart quickly. I said, "You get used to them." He grumbled, "Dollars should just be paper. Coins are annoying." He left Australia with pockets full of change he never figured out. I was finishing a shift at the hostel when an American guy came up to me and said, "You know what? I thought Australia was going to be like the US, just with different animals. But it's actually its own thing." I nodded. He continued, "At first, I was frustrated by all the differences. The slang, the coffee, the way people talk, the closing times, the tipping thing. It felt overwhelming. But now that I'm leaving, I kind of get it." He paused. "Australians aren't trying to be difficult. They just do things their own way. And honestly, some of it makes more sense than what we do." That moment stuck with me because it summed up what I'd seen over and over. Americans coming to Australia expecting it to be a rugged, dangerous wilderness or a carbon copy of home. Instead, they found a modern, developed country that just operated on different cultural rules. The confusion wasn't malicious. It was just the shock of realizing that Western country doesn't mean exactly like America. The funniest part was always watching the adjustment happen. Day 1, panic and questions. Day 3, frustration and complaints. Day 7, reluctant acceptance. Day 14, "Actually, I kind of like it here." By the time people left, most of them admitted they'd enjoyed Australia once they stopped fighting the differences, but some never adjusted. I had guests leave early because they couldn't handle the lack of structure, the casual attitudes, or the wildlife sounds at night. One guy said, "I just don't feel safe here," even though statistically, Australia's one of the safest countries in the world. Another woman said, "It's too far from everything," even though she'd stayed in Sydney the whole time, a city of 5 million people. The perception didn't match the reality, and no amount of explaining could fix it. The truth is, Australia isn't hard to survive. It's just different. And if you're coming from a place where everything's designed for maximum convenience and supervision, the shift to a culture that expects you to figure things out on your own can feel jarring. This is the kind of perspective shift most travelers never reach, and it's what I unpack every time. If you found yourself nodding through this, not mocking people but mapping behavior, you already belong here. Subscribing just keeps you in the conversation. Australians don't handhold. They assume you'll ask if you need help. Otherwise, you're fine. That independence freaks some people out. I still work at the hostel, and I still get the same questions every week. Is this safe? Do I need a guide? How do I know what to do? And every time, I give the same answer. Relax, you'll figure it out. And if you don't, just ask. Most people eventually do. But the stories of those first few days? Those never get old. And trust me, these stories never stop coming.